Maybe have people coming in a little bit later because of the new title, but I still see the numbers coming up, so we'll wait till it levels out. Elia, could you add me as, or Myra, could you add me as a co-host? I know at some point I'll, okay, great, thanks. All right, we're a couple of minutes past the hour now, so I think we can go ahead and get started. We'll welcome everyone to this week's LPI seminar. We're fortunate this week to have Kawe Borlina here. He's going to be presenting his talk on understanding the evolution of the early solar system through paleomagnetism of meteorites. Kawe is the Blaustein postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. He holds a PhD in planetary science from MIT and a bachelor's in aerospace engineering from the University of Michigan. His expertise is in the field of micropaleomagnetism, specifically how we use this technique to solve problems in planetary science. So for this talk, the way we'll handle questions is if you would just like to enter them in the chat box, we will address those in the last 15 minutes of this session. And we'll address all of those at the end of the talk. So without anything further from me, I'll turn it over to you, Kawe.
Awesome. Thank you so much for having me. As Sam said, my name is Kawe Borlina. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Johns Hopkins University. And what I'm going to be talking about today is some of the work I've been doing the last few years, specifically on using this novel technique from paleomagnetism named micropaleomagnetism to obtain insights about the evolution of the early solar system using meteorites. So to get started, I just wanted to briefly acknowledge the collaborators that provided feedback and support in this project here. There's a bunch of different backgrounds, which kind of highlights the multidisciplinary issue that we're going to be dealing with here today. And the first thing I like to say in my talks is that magnetic fields are everywhere in the universe. So the first illustration I have here is the protoplanetary disk. For people that are not familiar with those environments, these are essentially the birthplace of planets and stars in our universe. And there's good reason to believe the magnetic fields are playing a central role in the evolution of these environments, fundamentally setting the structure of planetary systems, not only in our Earth, but also elsewhere. We also have evidence that asteroids, as the one in the image here, produce magnetic fields deep in their interior, and some meteorites might have recorded the magnetic field. And of course, our very own Earth has a magnetic field that is being produced deep into the planet, and of course, not only the Earth, but also planetary bodies in our solar system. And the main focus of my research is obtain measurements of magnetic fields, mainly from the past, to solve problems in planetary science. And the method that I use to address that is called paleomagnetism. So for people that are not familiar with paleomagnetism, that is essentially the science of retrieving magnetic fields from rocks. And those are magnetic fields from the past that essentially locked in place and stayed over time, and we can bring it to the lab and obtain those records from the past. And before moving forward, I'm just gonna walk through the basics of paleomagnetism and the premise that we use to address those problems. So what you're seeing here is what we all gonna assume is essentially a rock formation, and everything's very hot, and minerals are falling as this rock is cooling. And some of those minerals that form, some of you might be familiar with, for example, magnetite or hematite. They will act as tiny little compass needles that, in the presence of a background magnetic field, they would essentially align themselves with this magnetic field. And as the rock cools down further, that magnetic record is now recorded in that particular rock sample that we're thinking here. And not only the strength of the magnetic field, but also the direction can be obtained in this simple assumption here. However, if after formation your rock is heated again to a temperature that we call the Curie temperature, above this temperature, what happens is all your magnetic records essentially gone. So the compass needles they have enough energy, they're just random now. And if you were to cool down, your magnetic record will be lost. And you can think here that if you were to have a different magnetic field that came later on, you would have the record from that second heating event. So these are the bases of paleomagnetism. And over time, this allowed us to solve and understand a lot about the evolution of the Earth, obtaining insights from meteorites, and that includes planetesimals and also in other terrestrial bodies in our planet. But fundamentally, paleomagnetism, and what I say about that, the traditional techniques used in paleomagnetism usually rely on samples that look like this, essentially. So those are cores that are about 2.5 centimeters in size. And that is because of the limitation of the instrumentation themselves, that you need to have enough samples so you can obtain those magnetic records. The field of study I work with is called micropaleomagnetism. So now with the higher sensitivity available with the techniques associated with micropaleomagnetism, we can measure magnetic fields of things that are about 100 micrometers in size. And with that, we can solve problems that we couldn't before, and we can look into questions that we couldn't address. And the main question I'm going to be talking about using this technique in this talk today is, how did the early solar system evolve? So I'm talking about 4.5 billion years ago. And specifically, the question is, how can we, what can we determine about the architecture and the processes that are active during that time? So to get into this question, we need to talk a little bit more about the protoplanetary disk. I briefly introduced in the beginning of the talk, but what you're seeing here is an image obtained with the ALMA telescope that shows a protoplanetary disk observed. And again, the birthplace of planets and stars in our universe. But what is particularly interesting about those environments is that they are essentially composed of gas and dust. And effectively, magnetic fields that are attached to this ionized gas that is thriving and being coupled to the protoplanetary disk ultimately drives processes that are active in those environments. So as a result, the magnetic fields embedded in protoplanetary disks would help dictate what is the architecture of planetary systems. And once again, the magnetic fields are doing that by driving angular momentum in those environments. So the next question then becomes, how do magnetic fields are transporting angular momentum in protoplanetary disks? And there's two main mechanisms through which that can occur. The first one is the MRI, or magnetorotational instability. And the second one is through magnetized disk winds. I'm going to briefly just give an overview of those processes here. So MRI can be explained by using this little diagram here. What you're seeing here is essentially a side view of a protoplanetary disk. The proto-sun is highlighted there in orange. And to talk about the MRI, we can think about a net vertical magnetic field that is coupled to the gas in this environment. And you can also think about two tiny little parcels of gas that are essentially attached to the magnetic field line. There's a little disturbance to this setup here, the red parts of gas would be a little bit closer to the sun, while the blue one would be further out, and the red one would be moving a little bit faster, while the blue one would be a little bit slower. And magnetic fields, they tend to be straight, and with that you produce some sort of torque that kind of creates this positive feedback, where now the red one's closer to the sun while the blue one's further out. And you can see how this can produce a loss in angular momentum and in the red parcel, and the gain of angular momentum in the blue one. And that's one way that you can move mass towards the central star while moving angular momentum to further out regions of the disk. The other process that is active in protoplanetary disks is the presence of magnetized disk winds. So to talk about the disk winds, we're going to have a little oblique perspective here of the disk. Once again, the orange semisphere there is the protosun. And in this case, we're also going to assume that the disk is spinning. And once again, we have a net vertical magnetic field in this setup. But because of a turbulence associated, you can think also about the MRI that I just thought about. You can essentially bend vertical magnetic field lines into radial ones. And by looking at the induction equation, what you can see is that for a spinning disk with a radial magnetic field, you produce a toroidal, or the B phi component of a magnetic field. And you can quickly realize that the toroidal magnetic field is essentially pinching the net vertical magnetic field. So as the disk tries to spin, the toroidal, the magnetic field is essentially holding the disk back, ultimately removing angular momentum. And there is this buildup of pressure associated with this pinching action that essentially releases material from the disk, and that's why it's called a disk wind. So through those two processes, magnetic fields can transport angular momentum in those environments. And there is, of course, a little bit of oversimplification, because as more complex models have been done to understand the role of magnetic fields in those environments, the very micro scale becomes very important. So there is some aspects of that I simplified here for the sake of explaining the processes. And the next question then becomes, how can we measure those magnetic fields? And there's two ways that we can do that. One is through astronomical observations, and those are very challenging and ongoing. So the astronomical community has been pursuing those for a long time, and it's something that's very challenging to do. We might be getting there with ALMA now. But the other way to do it is by using samples that formed in protoplanetary disk environments. And an example of that are meteorites. In fact, some meteorites in our collection, they formed during the first few million years of our own protoplanetary disk phase, which we call the solar nebula. So it's possible that some of the meteorites and their components could have recorded this magnetic field from this time when our own solar system was a protoplanetary disk. And in fact, when we look at our early solar system, we see something very interesting, specifically when we measure meteorites and their components. We see what people have called the great isotopic dichotomy. So essentially, when you measure isotopic measurements of meteorites and their components, we observe those two families of meteorites. One is called the non-carbonaceous, and the other one is called the carbonaceous one. So it doesn't matter the meteorite and the component you measure, you're usually going to fall into one of those two reservoirs, essentially. How those reservoirs were formed, how they were kept apart is not quite clear, but there's good reason to believe that they formed within 7 AU in the early solar system. But what we can do from a paleomagnetic perspective is take this information, there's two reservoirs, to ultimately probe magnetic fields from two distinct regions in the early solar system. So by using that, we can obtain insights about magnetic fields in two locations in the solar nebula. And in fact, there's been previous studies that have looked at meteorites and their components, specifically paleomagnetic measurements of meteorites and components. In the x-axis here, I'm showing time after solar system formation in million years. In the y-axis, I'm showing strength of the magnetic field. And what you're seeing here are a compilation of measurements of the magnetic field of the solar nebula during the first about 6 million years of the solar system formation. And there's a few things I want to highlight here. The first thing is that we have evidence for magnetic fields in both regions, in those two reservoirs that I mentioned early, during the first 3 million years. And then after that, all we have are essentially upper limits that seem to suggest that we don't have an evidence for a magnetic field after that time. So there's specifically three main questions that I kind of explored in the last few years. And I'm gonna just kind of go through them and just kind of put them in the context of this talk. So the first question is, when did the solar nebula disperse and how fast that happened? And the topic of this particular question is addressed in a paper that's currently under review. It should be coming out shortly. I'm not gonna focus on that in this talk because this involves bulk samples, and I'm happy to talk about it during the Q&A. But the other two questions that I'm gonna focus on this talk is, the first one is, what is the strength of the magnetic field in the carbonaceous reservoir? So as we can see here, for the non-carbonaceous, we have a well-established measurement of that region, but we don't have one for the carbonaceous reservoir. So we'll be, I'll be showing some of our results that we published last year on that particular topic. And the other question that I'm also gonna talk about here is, what was the beginning at the what was the strength of the magnetic field at the very beginning of the solar system, and how specifically we might be able to obtain records from this time. So to talk about those paleomagnetic measurements, I need to introduce the samples that we use to measure them. And for our studies, we use CO Carbonaceouschondrites. For people that are not familiar with Carbonaceouschondrites, they look like this. I like to say that they're essentially space sedimentary rocks. And the reason for that is because you have all these different components just kind of flying in space. They got accreted into one main meteorite, and it hasn't been melted ever since. And what is also interesting about Carbonaceouschondrites is that these components can be identified. So let me highlight that in this little diagram here. So the first components that we have in Carbonaceouschondrites are the calcium aluminum rich inclusions, also known as CAIs. Those are the very first solids to form in the solar system. After that, we have chondrus, which is essentially quickly cool molten droplets of space dust, essentially, that formed also in the solar nebula environment. And then finally, you have the matrix material, which is just fine grain, clumps everything together into one main meteorite. But what is very exciting about Carbonaceouschondrites is that with one sample, you will essentially get three different projects. And that is because each one of those components are recording the magnetic field at a different time and a different location. So going back to the little diagram I had earlier, we have the CAIs. They record the magnetic field at the very beginning of the solar system formation, likely close to the sun. I want to talk a little bit more about that later. We also have the chondrus, which record magnetic fields at about 2 million years after the formation of the CAIs, but in the outer solar system, so in the regions further out. And then at some point, the CIs and the chondrus share the same reservoir in the outer solar system, or beyond 3 AU. And then the parent body of this meteorite form accreted. And that's when the matrix acquired its magnetic records at about 3 to 5 million years, resulting from parent body alteration. And in this study here, we focused on two CO chondrites, that is Allen Hill 77307 and Dominion region 08006. And the reason why I like to mention them is because these are meteorites that have experienced very little alteration in their parent bodies. So for people that are familiar with the naming and the classification, that would be a CO 300301. So it provides a very unique opportunity to conduct paleomagnetic measurements with a sample that haven't been extensively altered. And before moving forward, I want to kind of talk about how meteorites acquire magnetic fields. So how do we expect those magnetic records to be retained by those different components? So the first thing that we can think about is the chondrus and some inclusions flying in space. They're red here because they're hot above the Curie temperature. And in the presence of a background magnetic field of the solar nebula, as they cool down, they will likely acquire the magnetic record. So now they're floating in space, and because they're floating in space, we lost the sense of direction. So the only information we can get from them is intensity. And then they get accreted to the parent body or the planetesimal. And during this process, there could be some parent body alteration in the matrix. And if there is a background magnetic field, it could be a planetesimal dynamo, it could be maybe solar nebula magnetic field. That alteration would not acquire a magnetic record that is likely different from that of the inclusions. And if nothing happened to the sample since its initial formation, some disturbance will make it to fall into the earth, and we can collect and measure in our laboratory. So that would be a Carbonaceouschondrite with primary magnetic records. One thing that people love to do with meteorites is to stick magnets to them to see if they're actually meteorites. And for most measurements that people can conduct, that doesn't interfere with the measurements. But for paleomagnetic studies, when you put a magnetic when you put a magnet next to your sample, you essentially reset any magnetic record that your sample can have. So that's one way to, for example, completely eliminate any magnetic record that you had, any primary magnetic record. And what would you see? Something like this. Essentially, everything is pointing in the same direction. Now, the other thing that can also happen is during atmospheric entrance, you can have high enough temperatures that could potentially reset. And of course, you can also have the case that parent body alteration could completely alter and modify the primary magnetic records. So in this case, when the inclusions and the matrix are all pointing in the same direction, they'll likely suggest a Carbonaceouschondrite that doesn't have a primary magnetic record. Okay, so now let's focus a little bit on the magnetic record of the chondrules and what type of work we did here to obtain this magnetic record. So just a brief reminder here, the chondrules recorded magnetic fields at about 2 million years after the CAI formation, after the solar system formation in the outer solar system region. And specifically, we targeted one type of chondrule known as dusty olivine. And that is because those types of chondrules are known to be good, robust paleomagnetic targets. Here you're seeing an image of backscatter electron imaging showing a dusty olivine chondrule from Allen Hill 77307. They're called dusty because of essentially pure iron inclusions embedded in the olivine matrix. And there's been several studies over the last essentially 10 years that have looked at the paleomagnetic properties of chondrules, and dusty olivine chondrules are ideal paleomagnetic targets. So if you were to measure random chondrules, you likely won't get any magnetic, but you have to target those specific types of chondrules. And one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that they are very rare to find within CO chondrites. About 1 in 70 or 80 chondrules are dusty olivine chondrules. Now, the next step after you identify your dusty olivine chondrules is isolating the chondrules from the matrix. So if you remember the image I showed before, your chondrules have essentially, they're embedded in this matrix material that have not only the chondrule that you're interested, but also CAI's matrix material. So when you're obtaining magnetic measurements from those inclusions, you want to make sure you're measuring the magnetic field of that particular sample and not the samples around. So a good chunk of time goes into preparing those samples for paleomagnetic study, which means extracting them, removing them, keeping them mutually oriented for the studies that I'm going to be talking about one second, and so forth. And after you extract, so you identify your chondrules, you extract them from the matrix, the next step is to obtain the magnetic records. And for this particular study, we're using the techniques from micropaleomagnetism. And there's two main techniques that I use in my work. One is the squid microscope, and the other one is the quantum diamond microscope, or the QDM. So I'm going to introduce both techniques and show what sort of data we get from them and what sort of magnetic records we obtain from each one of them, and how they can be used to understand the solar system records. So first, with the squid microscope, what you're seeing here is a standard data set that we obtained with the squid microscope. Essentially, what you're seeing here is the out-of-the-page component of the magnetic field from a chondrule. And if you look at the color bar on the right there, Earth's magnetic field, the one that we on average measure at the surface, is about 15 microteslas. And from this particular chondrule, we're looking at something 15 nanoteslas. So those are very weak magnetic fields. And that's why it's important to use micropaleomagnetism, because with traditional paleomagnetic techniques, you might not be able to measure, or you might be very close to the noise limit from the instrumentation. So with the squid microscope, we conduct our set of magnetic experiments. There is a complete a set of experiments we have to conduct to determine what is the magnetic record that the sample contains. Happy to talk about the details in the Q&A if people have questions. For the people that are interested, we used alternating field demagnetization to extract those magnetic records. And what is interesting about the squid microscope is that you can, once again, obtain those records and measure those very weak samples. With the QDM, we have a trade-off here. So while the squid microscope provide you with very high sensitivity to measure those weak magnetic fields, the QDM now provides you with very high spatial resolution. So what you're seeing here is the out of the page component of the magnetic field from a chondrule, but instead of being further away from the chondrule to the point that you can barely see it, what you're seeing is the dashed line of the actual chondrule. You can see the contour of the chondrule. So what we did here was we conducted our experiments with the squid microscope with our chondrules. And then at the end of it, we applied a very strong magnetic field to our samples such that all the magnetic carriers just kind of light up. So when you put under the QDM, you can identify where within the chondrule the magnetic field is coming from. And for this particular sample, because we have this pure iron embedded in this olivine and it's kind of all over the place, we should expect to see a uniform magnetic field distribution all over the chondrule. And that's kind of what we see with the QDM. So this kind of supports that our dusty olivine chondrules, the iron inclusions within the dusty olivine chondrules are carrying the magnetic records. It's likely to be primary. So together, those techniques, one allows you to obtain the magnetic record, while with the QDM, you can obtain insights about rock magnetism and determines where your magnetic record is coming from. But that being said, it is still not clear if the chondrules contain a robust record. So what I mean by that, remember where I mentioned before that your sample can be reheated during atmospheric entrance, there is planetesimal alteration, there is people sticking magnets. So how do you know that none of that happened? And there's two tests that we can do with our samples that are essentially conducted in traditional paleomagnetic studies that we can kind of apply in micropaleomagnetism. And the name of the tests are Conglomerate Test and Unidirectionality Test. So let me talk a little bit about the Conglomerate Test first. So going back to what I showed before, the chondrules with the solar nebula magnetic field, if nothing happened to them since their formation, when they got accreted, their magnetic direction should be random because once again, they're floating in space, right? Now, before moving forward, I'm going to be showing some eQuarr plots to highlight some of this data. So for people that are not familiar with eQuarr plots, those are 2D projections of 3D vectors. So let me kind of explain what that means. So if you have a vector out of the page, you would see an upper hemisphere data point right in the center. If you have a vector into the page to the right, that would be a lower hemisphere data point, essentially, that you'd be seeing. And to kind of just highlight what the data will look like for the case that you have a solar nebula record, you will see the magnetic directions dispersed along the eQuarr plot, suggesting that you have a solar nebula record. The chondrules have not been remagnetized since their formation. Versus if they're remagnetized after their accretion to the planetesimal, you would see all of them clustering into one direction. So let's look at some data. So we have two meteorites, once again, Allen Hill 77307 and Dom 08006. And when we look at the general directions of the chondrules that we measured so far, we see a spread in directions suggesting that the chondrules record a solar nebula field. Now there's a second test that we can do, and that's the unidirectionality test. So the idea of the unidirectionality test is that if you have a chondrule, so you're seeing here a reflected light image of a chondrule, if the chondrule has a direction, magnetic direction highlighted here in the green arrow, if you were to split that chondrule in half, if this chondrule acquired what we call a thermal process, so it cools through the through the background magnetic field acquired, that everything's uniform and homogeneous, that it should be the solar nebula record, you would be able to see the same magnetic directions in both parts. So what we did was split a few chondrules in half and measured them separately, just to kind of like highlight again, those are 100 micrometer, 150 micrometer size chondrules. So it's pretty interesting a thing to do to split them in half. So we split one in half, we measure a direction, that's the direction that we got. Then we split, then we measure the magnetic field of the other half while keeping them mutually oriented. And what we observe is that they're within arrow of each other. And we proceed to do that with two other chondrules. and we observe the same thing. They're within error of each other, suggesting that we have a uniform and robust magnetization within the chondrules. So now that we now that we supported that those are likely to be solar nebula records, then we can go back to the initial question that we'll look at, which is what was the strength of the magnetic field in the carbonaceous reservoir? And from the chondrules that we measured, we obtained a record of about 100 microteslas for the particular region in the early solar system. And what we can do next is compare our magnetic records with the models of solar nebula magnetic fields. So I'm going to be showing here in the x-axis distance from the sun in astronomical units, while in the y-axis I'm showing strength of the magnetic field. And there is studies that have looked at how magnetic fields are supposed to decay in protoplanetary disk environments, so we can use those models to plot the curves that I'm showing here. And there's two particular configurations that we can determine here. So one is what we call the aligned case. The net vertical magnetic field is aligned with the rotation axis of the disk, but you can also plot the anti-aligned case. So the net vertical magnetic field doesn't match with the rotation axis. And you can also plot this curve for different accretion rates. So the one you're seeing here is 10 to the -8, which is usually it's the kind of mean observed accretion rate from other planetary systems. But you can plot that for higher and lower accretion rates here. And what we can do on top of this plot is plot the data from the non-carbonaceous reservoir, which is closest to the sun, while plotting the data from the carbonaceous reservoir further out, and kind of compare what is happening in those two regions while looking at the models. So what we observe at the first order is that we have evidence for aligned polarity. Both data points seems to favor an aligned polarity for the early solar system. So we're going to be focusing on this aligned polarity plots for the remaining of the talk. But the other aspect that we observe here is that the data points are sitting in different accretion rates. Ultimately, what that means is that we have a mismatch in accretion rates in the solar nebula. So to say it differently, essentially, the accretion rate or the amount of material that's moving towards the sun in the carbonaceous reservoir is different than that of the non-carbonaceous reservoir. And it kind of begs the question, what is the mechanism responsible for this mismatch? So what is making that non-carbonaceous to have an accretion rate different than that of the non-carbonaceous? And there's two main candidates I want to discuss here. So the first one is accretion to Jupiter. So there is being a hypothesis proposed before that the reason why we observed those two reservoirs in the early solar system is because Jupiter essentially created those two regions or kept them apart in the very beginning of the solar system. So it is completely possible that Jupiter is responsible for this mass loss associated with those two regions. However, if we're looking at how much mass is being lost from the carbonaceous reservoir to the non-carbonaceous, and we look at the size of Jupiter, Jupiter would have to be way more massive to account for this mismatch. So that is not to say that Jupiter is not there, but it's unlikely that Jupiter itself is responsible for this mismatch that we're observing. Another way to explain this is by invoking magnetized disk winds. So if you remember what I presented in the beginning of the talk, magnetized disk winds or a buildup of pressure associated with magnetic fields in protoplanetary disks can be an effective way to remove mass from protoplanetary disks. So let me elaborate a little bit on that a little bit more. So disk winds models have actually shown that this buildup of pressure and remove of mass from protoplanetary disks can be so massive that you can even open disk substructures. So what we're seeing here is an image from ALMA. And one thing that the ALMA surveys show all the time is that we observe gaps in many protoplanetary disks. So effectively, disk winds could be a very good mechanism to create gaps in the early solar system. That is essentially an outcome of heavy magnetic fields embedded in protoplanetary disks. So as a result, you would have disk winds existing in those environments and eliminating mass, which would explain those two reservoirs coexisting in the early solar system. So to kind of step back and put in the context of those two reservoirs and just kind of summarizing here our results from the chondrules, the magnetic spatial variation that we're observing between the non-carbonaceous and the carbonaceous reservoir can be associated with the presence of Jupiter that kept those two reservoirs apart, but can also be associated with a magnetized disk wind that is essentially removing mass and creating this mismatch in accretion rate that we observe in our magnetic data. Now, what I want to focus the remaining of the talk is on a new area of research that I've been exploring in the last year, and that is paleomagnetic measurements of calcium aluminum rich inclusions, or the CAIs. So I briefly introduced them in the beginning of the talk, and I just kind of want to go through some of the arguments again. So CAIs have been proposed to form close to the sun. So there is mineralogical as a topic evidence that suggests that CAIs formed in regions very near to the sun. There is, however, a problem, or maybe an observation that needs to be explained, which is the majority of meteorites, the majority of CIs are observed in meteorites that formed in the outer solar system. So at some point, the CIs had to have formed close to the sun, then the chondrites formed further out a few million years later, and some sort of transport mechanism had to move the CIs from close to the sun to further out. And then finally, they got a credit to the meteorites that we observe, that we see more CIs. So what we're interested in doing here is try to understand what mechanisms were present in the early solar system by obtaining magnetic measurements of CIs. So specifically, can we understand the processes that were active in the solar nebula by measuring magnetic records from CIs? And before moving forward, I want to kind of introduce CI mineralogy and what are potential magnetic carriers that we can search for CIs. So for people that are not familiar with calcium aluminum inclusions, here's an example of one from DOMS 08006. They're again called calcium aluminum rich inclusions because of the minerals that are rich in calcium aluminum. So you see things like perovskite, hibonite, malachite, spinel. But one thing that the literature kind of hasn't been explored too much is the potential of CIs as paleomagnetic targets. There's been reports of iron, nickel, and CIs, but the sizes and the frequency of them hasn't been extensively determined. So that was the first step of our process here, to identify potential magnetic carriers within CIs that could be used or could support using them as paleomagnetic targets. And what we observe in many CIs, including the one we were seeing here, is iron nickel metal in both composition and sizes that are ideal for paleomagnetic targets. So motivated by that, we conducted paleomagnetic experiments with 5 CIs. For people that are interested, we used 3 millilite rich CIs and 2 hibonite rich. And once again, we use micropaleomagnetism to obtain the magnetic records. So I introduced this before, where we're using the squid microscope and the QDM in the same fashion as before. With the squid microscope, we see data sets that look like this. We also use alternating field magnetization to obtain our magnetic records from the CAIs. And what you're seeing here is, once again, the out-of-the-page component of the magnetic field. And once again, for reference, Earth's magnetic field is about 50 microteslas. So we conducted our paleomagnetic measurements to obtain information about the direction. And I showed this before, the equatorial plot, where we have the chondrites data that we obtained before that suggests that this meteorite hasn't been remagnetized, passing the conglomerate test. So we can also plot here the CIs, since the chondrites and CIs were accreted to the meteorite at the same time. And what we observe is further evidence that this the inclusions in DOMS 006 likely record the solar nebula field. And once again, that's because we don't have a cluster direction. They're spread across the equatorial plot, suggesting that those records are nebula. Now, we use the squid microscope to obtain our magnetic records. We obtain the intensity of the magnetic field that they recorded. We obtain the direction of the magnetic field. We can now use the QDM, the quantum diamond microscope, to conduct rock magnetic work. So what you're seeing here is an out-of-the-page component of the magnetic field of a CAI. And similar to what we did before is, we use the squid microscope to demagnetize our samples and obtain our magnetic records. And after we're done, we apply a very strong magnetic field to our samples, such that all the magnetic carriers just light up. and we can look under the QDM because it has a high spatial resolution. And what we see with CIs is very complex magnetism. So there's lots of areas within the CI that are magnetically alive. And one thing that we can do with QDM, and I've done this in the past for Earth rocks, the Jack Hills, is to combine the QDM with transmission electron microscopy. So let me kind of walk through this, what that means here. So we have the QDM map, and we can target magnetic regions that we know that has magnetic signal with TEM to see what is in there. Is it an iron nickel metal phase that is primary, or is it potential secondary product such as magnetite that wouldn't be a primary record? So we targeted that one magnetic region that we have there with TEM. And what we observe is the presence of iron nickel metal and sometimes even pure iron in, once again, the composition and size that are ideal for paleomagnetic targets. So this seems to support that we have robust paleomagnetic records coming from our CIs. I just want to disclaim this very quick. This is initial results from our TM. And as you can see, the CI itself is very complex. There's a lot of different magnetic areas. So we're looking now into all of those different regions to obtain a more comprehensive interpretation of what are the magnetic areas with CIs, and to really make sure if they're all primary, and if not, how can we separate this potential primary magnetic record from the secondary. So now stepping back and looking to the question, what was the strength of the magnetic field in the beginning of the solar system? From the CIs that we measured, we obtained a magnetic record of about 150 microteslas. And we can do similar to what we did with the Chondrites. We can compare our solar nebula magnetic field records with models that describe magnetic fields in the early solar system. So you're seeing here in the x-axis distance from the sun, and the y-axis the strength of the magnetic field. And now we're plotting curves that assume accretion rates that are a bit higher than what I assumed before, and that is because the CIs formed right in the beginning of the solar system. So things were a little bit more active, accretion is a little bit more intense. So those numbers kind of represent that. And we can plot essentially the intensity of the CIs that we obtain in this plot. And what we observe, which is about 150 microteslas. And what we observe is that this magnetic record is consistent with CIs forming at about 8 AU. So I'm not saying that the CIs formed in the outer solar system, but their magnetic record was acquired at several AU during either formation or transport in the solar system. So we can maybe talk a little bit about what are mechanisms that could produce this, given that CIs form close to the sun. So the question is essentially, how can we explain this magnetism? And there is two main mechanisms that we can invoke here to explain this record. And to do that, I'm going to be using this little diagram here, which shows, once again, the protoplanetary disk. The first mechanism that we can think about is disk winds. So similar to what I was just talking about the Chondrites and I was talking early that could drive angular momentum protoplanetary disks. Disk winds are a very effective way of lifting dust from the mid-plane of protoplanetary disk, heat it up, and form CIs, but also transport them further out because they're essentially launching material. So you can envision a scenario here where the CI is either forming a disk wind or being lifted through a disk wind and launch it to the outer solar system. And in that time, the CI would get hot enough above the current temperature. And as it falls down in the outer solar system, would acquire the magnetic record in those regions. Another mechanism is the stellar outburst. So there's been several ways, and I mentioned one in the beginning of the talk, which is magnetorotation stability, to fundamentally move CIs or material in general from close to the sun to further out regions. So you could envision a scenario here where the CIs form close to the sun, they moved further out through, for example, MRI, and then a stellar outburst happens, heats up the entire disk to a temperature above the current temperature. And then when it cools down, the CIs acquire the magnetic record from those regions further out. So those two mechanisms, either disk winds or the presence of MRI together with stellar outbursts, could explain the magnetism of CIs that we're observing here. But to me, I think what kind of summarizes the CI part is that the CIs contain robust magnetic records with something that hasn't been explored in paleomagnetism. So I think there's a very exciting direction to pursue here. And most important, those results seems to provide insights about what was happening in the early solar system, suggesting that either magnetized disk winds or stellar outbursts were present at that time. And overall, this kind of highlights how we can use paleomagnetic records from CIs, which once again have been extensively studied in mineralogical processes and isotopic studies, but we haven't really looked at from a paleomagnetic perspective. And it can tell us about early solar system processes through a new way. So I just want to summarize my talk here. So we have chondrites from Carbonaceouschondrites that contain robust magnetic records. From those chondrites and look into the context of previous magnetic records, magnetic fields are driving angular momentum globally. And the accretion rates from those two reservoirs seem to be matching. And this could be associated with disk winds or the presence of Jupiter, essentially. And the presence of disk winds would likely form this substructure or a gap in the early solar system that could explain why we were observing those two reservoirs at that time. And from the CIs potentially recorded fields at the very beginning of the solar system, and those fields can be used to tell us about formation and or transport mechanisms that were present at that time. Thanks for listening to this. Feel free to reach out, ask questions. I'm also going to be here happy to answer questions you might have. Again, thanks for having me, and yeah, have a good day. Thank you.
All right, sorry, I was having trouble getting off the mute there. Thank you so much, Cal. So I'll give him a hand virtually here. So for questions, what we'll do is if you guys want to type your questions into the chat box, I'll read those off in order. And then as we go through that, if people have additional questions toward the end, they can just raise their hand. So we've got some time for questions, and I guess I can actually get us started. So I'm not seeing any written in the chat box yet. Great talk, by the way, really cool stuff. It's a really interesting perspective to think about the disk structure in this way, and I think it's really informative for a lot of the assumptions that get made through like the geochemistry and isotope work that have been done looking into the isotopic dichotomy. So it's really nice to see. I have just kind of probably an ignorant question, but so we're obviously preserving the intensity of the magnetic field in these different grains. I'm wondering, does the magnetic field actually, you talked about the formation of these gaps possibly. Does that also affect the distribution of the different mineral components that are forming in the solar system? Are you going to have like a redistribution of the magnetic materials, or metals, sulfides and things like that might react with the magnetic field to where you end up having a lot in one area and a lot more of metals and sulfides in another?
You're talking about effectively if the concentration of magnetic materials could affect the intensities that we were observing. Is that?
Well, so more like, will the magnetic field affect the distribution? Like so you've talked about how it can affect essentially the accretion rates and causing, gaps in the disk. Also actually have a differential effect on the magnetic materials, like will it move the metals around into different areas or things like that?
I see. Okay, that's a very interesting. I never thought about that way. That could, well, it would make sense, right? Because essentially ferromagnetic things would be attached to the magnetic field lines, right? So it is possible. I guess I never thought about that. That's a very interesting study. So I maybe the thing that I would maybe wonder is, do we see that much just pure iron nickel metal blobs flying in space during the time those things are happening? Because usually would have like a chondrite or you have a CI, right? They would, usually the iron nickel phase would be attached to something else, and supposedly the chondrules and the chondrules precursor would be other chondrules and maybe CAI material. So the iron nickel would be already kind of attached to them. It would be interesting if, for example, we observe more metal things close to the sun because the magnetic field is likely to be stronger there. That's a very interesting question. Never thought about that way. That's maybe interesting project there, I guess.
Yeah, no, it'd be interesting to see what the magnetism studies can show from that. I mean, there are, people make a lot of assumptions about what the disk structure was based on the chemistry of the different meteorite components. And so one of the broad assumptions that I think is being questioned now is that there's, this trend from reduced, more metal-rich materials in the inner solar system towards more volatile-rich materials in the outer solar system. And so I think there was a study by McDonough and Yoshizaki a while back that had talked about the idea that this could be related to magnetism, but they're not paleomagnetism researchers, so it's kind of a, it was a hypothesis to explain some other component. But anyway, I could talk to you for a while about that, so let me
that's very interesting. That's a very interesting thought.
Okay, John Littleton has a question. He's asking if you can elaborate more on the magnetic differences between non-carbonaceous and carbonaceous samples. Are non-carbonaceous meteorites considered metallic, i.e. nickel, iron in nature?
Yeah, so I guess the non-carbonaceous and carbonaceous dichotomy, you could find iron meteorites in both families, essentially. The reason why it's just called carbonaceous and non-carbonaceous is because in the one side, you have the carbonaceouschondrites and the chondrules that have one signature, which matches some of the iron meteorites. And then you have the non-carbonaceous. So it's not necessarily like a metallic dichotomy or something like that. But I think that kind of ties to your question that you just asked him, because it might be something like that. And that could be because of magnetic fields. That's a very interesting point. But from at least from how the convention came to be, that's not the premise. Usually, very few people care about metal, which it's kind of great to hear all those questions. From a magnetic perspective, we should care more about metal.
Absolutely. Well, you're talking to a good group. I think quite a few of us care a bit about the meteoritic metals. Bill Spitzeri is asking, just to confirm, scientists don't use magnets when collecting in Antarctica?
So yes, there is a good chunk of time where scientists would use magnets to collect. With more paleomagnetic studies using meteorites over the years, there is a communication between the community and people in the field that kind of tone down a little bit of people using magnets. And I think now the expeditions don't use magnets anymore. But one thing that we sometimes observe is, for example, you're in Antarctica, everything is white, and you see those black rocks, right? So as long as you identify one as a meteorite, the other ones are also likely to be. So in an expedition, you might have a few that were identified to be a meteorite with a magnet. That one is completely zapped. You cannot use that. But the other ones might be kind of saved. So Allen Hills, which is the one that we use here, we observe what we call a low corrosivity over print. That means that it wasn't completely zapped, but it's a little zapped. So some of those records, we have to be a little bit careful when looking at them. But for example, Dom has not been zapped at all. And it could have been, and those were collected a little bit time ago. So maybe it was just luck. So nowadays they're doing a much better job. There's a lot of communication. Everyone knows that you should zap your samples and things like that.
Great. Our next question is from Jahan. He says, Mingchan Liu and myself reported the aluminum magnesium data of hibonite-rich CAIs from ALHA 77307, showing some spread in initial 26-27 aluminum isotopic ratios. So your DOM CAIs may not record the magnetic field at time 0. Does this make your interpretation different?
A great question. It's the assumptions that we use for dating those things. So yes, if the CIs are not recording the magnetic field at time 0, then the stellar outbursts are not likely to be there, and those would be 2 million years or million years records later, when the protoplanetary disk is likely to be a little bit more calm. It's still, so what maybe I would drop. So actually, if we have evidence that the CIs are not at the time 0, that would actually make us drop the stellar outburst scenario, because stellar outbursts are not likely to exist when the protoplanetary disk is calmer. So that would just kind of support magnetized disk winds. So it would be CIs forming close to the sun and getting moved to further out regions just through magnetized disk winds. So I don't want to get into what should be my favorite answer here, because I know this is a debated topic, but it would likely just drop the stellar outburst, because there wouldn't be any stellar outbursts at that time. It's a very good question. It's a very good, important point that I should probably spend more time talking about it, I guess, to make sure that, you know, we assume that the CI is from the beginning of the solar system, right?
So I think we're probably on to our last question here. This is from John Littleton. He'd like to know more about the techniques that are used to extract chondrules from the matrix and isolate the chondrule from surrounding matrix. How do you isolate the magnetic, quote, interference of the matrix from the chondrule being measured?
Yeah, so a great question. So when it comes to magnetic measurements, from the separation to the measurements, you have to make sure that everything you're using is non-magnetic. So we have this essentially dental tool that we demagnetize. And what I'm actually doing is physically scrubbing matrix out of the chondrule. Essentially what I'm happy to talk more about those details later, and we describe them in the paper as well. But you just create a trench around the chondrule that you remove all the matrix material that is visible. And then you just splunk out the chondrule from it. There are other things that you can add to make sure you can orient them and things like that. You can glue a tiny piece of glass on top of the chondrule so that you can hold the chondrule, because it's 150 micrometers. But that's essentially what we do. We physically remove matrix from the chondrule. I'm very interested in creating a better extraction process, because this takes a lot of time. And one of the things I'm very interested about is increasing the amount of samples we can analyze for this sort of studies. So people have ideas. I've been thinking about potentially using some sort of lasers that don't heat up the sample, so you might not, cause any magnetic overprints. There's like some ideas that I've been thinking about that I'm interested in pursuing. So if people are interested in also trying to think about those things together, I'm happy to talk about it as well.
Very cool. I hadn't thought about chondrite dentistry and the matrix.
You become a surgeon during your PhD, effectively.
Well, we do have one quick last question from Project Domain. So this will be the last question, and then we'll close out. So she wants to know, what is the resetting temperature for magnetic fields in the iron, nickel, metal, and CAIs, and how does that compare with the closure temperature?
Sam, I think I lost you there.
The aluminum.
Right. Okay.
Hello.
Sorry, did that come through? My internet keeps backing out.
Yeah.
Project, if you want to ask the question, you can.
I got the question. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Hi.
I think this is.
I'm from India.
Go ahead.
Wait 1 second. Oh, there you go.
Okay, you explained about calcium aluminum inclusions, right? And it comes under chondrite, like stony meteorites, right?
Yes.
Okay. And you also told that it records the magnetic field at the time of the solar system formation, and which means that they are the one. CIs are one of the first solids to have condensed in the solar nebula, right?
That's correct. Yes, that's the assumption. Yes.
Okay, so what about the presolar grains? Could you explain, or do you know anything about presolar grains?
Yeah, what we observe is usually presolar grains are contained within inclusions. So they were usually, probably people in the scholar are more experts than me on this, but they were injected into the solar system, and that's why they're called presolar, right? And they tend to be way smaller than those CIs and chondrite inclusions that we observe. So there's also, one thing that could be very interesting here, and we've been thinking about this, that some of the iron nickel metal that we observe in CIs can be from presolar grains that are metal rich. So they could be also carrying some of that magnetic record. And yeah, and then I think that kind of ties to the other question that I think Sam was reading there, which is, so the iron nickel metal temperature, or the Curie temperature, is about 780 degrees. So way below the condensation temperature. I'm blanking now on the temperature for the aluminum magnesium system, but I'm pretty sure that's higher than 700 Kelvin. If someone would say something about that, but I think so my point is that it's possible to reset the magnetization, but not the aluminum magnesium system.
So which means that there's a pre-solar silicon carbide, like there are types of pre-solar grains like diamond, silicon carbide, graphite, silicon nitride, oxides, etc. Also like refractory metal nuggets. These are the types of pre-solar grains. And so what you told is that these pre-solar grains, silicon carbide enclosed in the CIAs was formed during the earliest star forming episodes, right?
Likely formed before, even in the solar system, right? They're pre-solar, right? So they likely formed even before the CAIs. They came from other environments. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. The talk was nice.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that takes us to the end of the hour. So let's all give Kawe another virtual hand. Thank you so much, Kawe, for this great talk. Super informative, great discussion afterward. And you'll probably be hearing more from some of us.
Great. Yeah, no, feel free to reach out. Yeah, everyone, feel free to reach out if you have more questions. Happy to talk more about this. The CI work is work in progress. So yeah, definitely happy to chat more about it. And thanks for having me. I had a great time.
Great. Yeah, thanks. We're looking forward to hearing more from you.
Sounds good. Bye, everyone.
Thanks for coming this week, everyone.